the spring of 1887, in the high sage country east of Helena, in the Montana Territory, a woman of 29 stood at the top of a cellar stair with a lamp in one hand and a cold iron key in the other. And behind her, 3 men of the town told her plainly that if she had any sense, she would turn around and let the dead keep what was theirs. She did not turn around. She had buried a husband 6 weeks before, and she had learned in that time that the living are more frightened of a closed door than the dead ever are. The cellar had been sealed for 11 years. The man who sealed it was gone now, and the men on the porch above her knew only the warning that had been handed down with the deed, never the reason. She knew something they did not. She knew how a thing is built to be opened by exactly one kind of hand. Her name was Ada Vance, and she had come to that ranch a stranger and a bride, and she was leaving it, if she left it at all, as the only person willing to learn what the warning was hiding. The house sat on a bench of dry grass above a creek that ran brown in spring and silver in fall, and the cellar door was set into the slope behind the kitchen, framed in stone, banded in iron, and held by a lock that no one in living memory had been able to turn. Her husband Thomas had never spoken of it without changing the subject. The neighbors spoke of it only to warn her off. Stay close a while and you will see why a woman with nothing but a borrowed lamp and a dead man's craft did the one thing the whole valley had agreed for 11 years not to do. Ada had not been raised to ranch. She had been raised in the back of a locksmith shop in St. Joseph, Missouri, where her father, Elias Hargrove, kept a bench of files and pins and blank keys, and where she had learned before she was 12 that a lock is not a wall but a question, and that every question has an answer, if you are patient enough to feel for it in the dark. Her father had been a quiet man with burned forearms and a way of holding a stubborn mechanism up to the lamp and turning it slowly, the way another man might turn a coin he was not sure was real. He told her that locks were honest. People lied, he said, and ledgers lied, and even church bells could be made to lie. But a lock told you exactly what it was the moment you understood how it had been made. He died of a winter fever when she was 19, and she had carried his roll of picks and his smallest files in a leather satchel ever since. Through a marriage proposal from a Montana cattleman she barely knew, and a wedding she barely remembered, and 4 years of a life that had no use for any of it. Thomas Vance had been kind in the careless way of a man who had never had to think hard about another person. He had inherited the ranch from an uncle, a man named Josiah Vance, who had built the house and the barn and the sealed cellar and had died. The story went, with the cellar key around his neck and a warning on his lips. Thomas had been a boy then, sent for from the east, and he had grown up on the place under the shadow of that closed door and the rule that came with it. The rule was simple. The cellar stayed shut. Thomas obeyed it the way he obeyed the weather, without curiosity, because the alternative was effort. When Ada had asked him once, early, what was down there, he had looked at her as though she had asked what was inside the moon, and said only that his uncle had wanted it left alone, and that a man kept faith with the dead by leaving their doors where they found them. Then Thomas was thrown from a green horse in the first week of a wet March, and he did not get up. And Ada found herself the widow of a man she had not fully known, on a ranch she did not fully own, in a valley that did not fully want her. The will, read out by a lawyer down in town, left her the house and the land and the stock, but it left them encumbered. There was a note against the property, the lawyer said, held by the Helena Stock and Land Company, and the note had been signed by Josiah Vance the year before he died, and it had been compounding quietly ever since. The sum had grown to be larger than the ranch was worth. Unless she could pay it by the first snow, the company would take the land the house, and the cattle, and she would walk away from 4 years of her life with a satchel of locksmith's tools and nothing else. The man who delivered this news with the most courtesy was named Royce Calloway, and he was the agent for the Helena Stock and Land Company, a tall and unhurried man who wore a town suit and spoke as though every hard thing he said were a regret he was sharing with her rather than a sentence he was passing. He came out to the ranch the week after the funeral, on a good bay horse with a polished saddle, and he wiped his boots at her door before she had asked him to, which she would remember later as the gesture of a man practiced at seeming kind. He sat at her kitchen table, declined her coffee with a small lift of his hand, and laid a leather folio in front of him and opened it the way a doctor opens a bag. Then he explained the arithmetic of her ruin in a voice so gentle it took her a moment to understand she was being robbed. He said the company did not wish to be unkind. He said that a widow alone could not work the place, that the note was the note, that the figures were the figures, and no feeling of his could change them. He turned the folio so she could see the columns, the original sum, the years of compounding, the total at the foot of the page underscored twice in a clerk's neat ink, and the number was larger than anything she had ever owned or owed. He said that if she would sign a paper releasing her claim now, the company would see to it she had a stage fare back to wherever she had come from, and a small consideration besides for her trouble. He laid the release on the table and set a pen beside it and folded his hands and waited, the way a patient man waits for a thing he is sure is already his. Ada looked at the columns a long while. She had grown up at a bench where numbers were filed into keys, and a wrong measurement meant a ruined blank, and she had a feel for when a figure had been made to lie. Something in the underscored total sat wrong with her, too round and too large, and arrived at too smoothly. But she had no proof and no standing, and a dead husband 6 weeks in the ground, so she said nothing of it. She told Calloway only that she would consider it, which was a small lie, the only kind her father had ever permitted, the kind you tell a lock when you pretend you have given up, so it will relax its guard. Calloway smiled as though her refusal were a charming delay, gathered his folio and his unsigned release, told her he would call again before the first snow, and rode back toward town through the long evening light. She watched him go from the porch until the bay horse was a small, dark, moving thing against the brown hills, and she thought, without yet knowing why, that a man does not ride out twice to a poor widow over a debt he is certain of. And it was that evening, alone in the house with the wind working at the eaves, that Ada took down the old deed from the trunk where Thomas had kept it and read it through by lamplight, and found at the bottom of the second page, in a different and older hand, a line that the lawyer had not read aloud. The line said that the cellar and its contents were not part of the encumbrance, that they had been accepted from the note by the express instruction of Josiah Vance, and that they passed entire and free to his heirs. She read the line 3 times. A man does not accept a hole in the ground full of potatoes from a mortgage. A man accepts a thing he knows to be worth more than the mortgage, and a man who seals that thing behind an iron door and warns the whole valley away from it for 11 years is not protecting them from what is inside. He is protecting what is inside from them. She sat with the deed open on her knees and the lamp guttering, and she let herself think it through to the end, the way her father had taught her to think a lock through before he ever touched it, all the way to the last pin before the first move. If the cellar held a thing worth more than the ranch, and if it had been kept from the company on purpose, then the company had a reason to want her gone before she found it. A grieving widow signs a release and rides away on a stage, and the cellar stays sealed forever under a new owner who has been told the same warning. That was the shape of it. The release Calloway had laid on her table was not mercy at all. It was the last turn of a lock that Josiah Vance had spent his life building against, and she had very nearly signed it. The next morning, she walked the half-mile down to the nearest neighbor, an old man named Bartholomew Reed, who ran a few sheep on the next bench over and who had known Josiah Vance in the early years. The path took her along the creek and up through a stand of cottonwood just coming into leaf, and she found Reed mending a length of fence with wire and a pair of fencing pliers, working slow because of his back, his small flock scattered gray across the hillside behind him. He was past 70, bent and slow, with hands like roots and an eye that had gone milky on one side, and he met her at his fence with the wariness of a man who had learned that visitors brought trouble. He did not stop his work until she said her name and her husband's. Then he set the pliers on the top wire and looked at her properly. She asked him about the cellar. He looked away toward the mountains for a long while before he answered, and when he did, his voice had the flatness of a thing recited so often it had worn smooth. He said that Josiah had sealed it the same year the Helena Company first came into the valley buying notes. He said Josiah had told him near the end that he had put something down there that would settle accounts when the right person came to open it, and that the wrong person never could. Then Josiah had died, and the key was never found, and the company had let the warning stand because a sealed cellar suited them well enough. Ada asked him what he thought was down there. Reed worked his jaw a moment and said he did not think. He said thinking about that cellar had cost 2 men their peace already, men who had tried the lock and failed and gone a little strange after, and that he had decided long ago to leave it the rule it was. Then he looked at her satchel, at the worn leather and the shape of the tools inside it, and something shifted in his good eye. He asked, almost against his will, whether she was the locksmith's daughter. Folks said she was. She said she was. He was quiet again, and then he said that if anyone living could turn that lock, it would be a hand that understood how Josiah's mind had worked, because Josiah had been a clever and a bitter man, and he had not built that lock to keep honest people out. He had built it to keep dishonest people out forever, and to let one honest hand in. That was the first of it. The valley believed the warning. The company was content with the warning. And one woman who had grown up at a locksmith's bench had read a single accepted line in an old deed and understood that the warning was not a warning at all. It was an instruction, written for a hand that had not yet arrived. Hers had arrived. She went back to the house, and she looked at the cellar door for a long time before she touched it. The door itself was oak, 4 inches thick, gone gray with weather, banded across with 3 straps of hand-forged iron. The lock was set into the center band, a great square iron case the size of a family Bible, with a single keyhole shaped not like the simple wards of an ordinary door, but like a narrow cross, the vertical slot long and the horizontal one set high and short. Ada had seen a keyhole like that exactly once, in a book of European lock plates her father had kept, and she had never seen one in the flesh. It was the mark of a particular kind of cabinet lock, the sort a clever maker built when he wanted the keyhole itself to lie about what lay behind it. She had no key. The key had died with Josiah, so she would have to make the lock give up its shape from the inside, the way her father had taught her by reading it. For 3 days she did nothing but study it. She took her father's smallest files and a candle and a hand glass, and she knelt at the door from the first gray light until she could no longer see, and she learned the lock out the way you learn a face. The first morning she did not touch the keyhole at all. She read the iron itself, the forge marks where a hammer had drawn the straps, the rust that bloomed thicker at the bottom of the case where damp had crept. The 4 small countersunk rivets that told her the case had been made to be opened from the front by a maker who never expected to need the back. She warmed beeswax in her palm and pressed it gently into the keyhole, and drew it out and held the cast to the candle. And she did this a dozen times, each time a little deeper, building in wax a ghost of the dark space no eye could enter. She found that the cross-shaped keyhole was false in part, that the horizontal slot led nowhere and was cut only to fool a man into bending his pick the wrong way, and that the true work lay deep along the vertical slot where the light could not reach. She found, by the careful insertion of a wax-tipped probe and the reading of the marks it brought back, that the lock had not one set of wards, but 2, a forward set that any patient thief might eventually pass, and behind it a second gate that would not move unless the forward set were held in a particular false position, while the second was worked. It was a lock built to punish cleverness. A skilled thief would pass the first gate, feel his success, force the second, and bind the whole mechanism solid forever. Only a hand that knew to do the unnatural thing, to hold the first gate wrong on purpose, could ever reach the second. Her father had a name for locks like this. He called them confessions, because the maker had built his whole suspicious heart into the iron. And if you were patient, you could read the man in the work. Reading the lock, Ada read Josiah Vance. She read a man who expected to be robbed, who trusted no neighbor and no court and no company, who had decided that the only justice he could count on was the kind he could forge himself and bury behind a door. She began to understand, kneeling in the cold, that whatever was down there was not treasure in the ordinary sense. A man who wanted to leave gold to his heirs left it in a bank. A man who built a lock like a trap and accepted it from a mortgage and warned the world away was leaving something that the world had reason to want destroyed. On the 4th day, she began to work the lock in earnest, and the work nearly broke her. She had filed 3 blank keys to the forward wards by the readings she had taken, sitting up past midnight at the kitchen table with a small vise and a row of files laid out by size the way her father had kept them, taking off iron in strokes thinner than a hair, and stopping every few strokes to fit the blank against her wax casts. Each in turn passed the first gate and bound against the second, and twice she felt the whole mechanism shudder toward the locked solid state her father had warned of, a deep wrong stiffness traveling up the key into her wrist, and twice she stopped her hand a hair's breadth before the ruin. Her fingers cramped until she could not straighten them and had to soak them in warm water by the stove before she could file again. Her knees went numb against the stone, and she folded a horse blanket beneath them and went on. She did not eat well and she did not sleep well, and the wind came down off the mountains at night and found every gap in the house. And once, deep in the 3rd night of trying, she sat back on her heels in the dark with a useless key in her cramped hand and wept, not for the lock, but for the simple human weight of being alone with a thing no one believed she could do, with a dead husband and a hostile town and a clock running toward the first snow. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve, and she lit the candle again, because her father had also taught her that a lock does not care whether you are tired, and the only argument it respects is your return. It was Bartholomew Reed who turned the work. He came up the slope on the 5th morning leaning on a stick, and he did not offer to help with the lock because he knew he could not. He offered something else. He sat on the cellar step in the sun and he talked. And out of his old memory came the thing she needed. He said that Josiah Vance had been a clockmaker before he was a cattleman, back in Ohio, before he came west, and that he used to say a good clock and a good lock were the same animal, that both kept a secret in their teeth and gave it up only to a hand that knew the hour. Ada sat very still. A clockmaker. She had been reading the lock as a locksmith reads a lock, looking for the false ward and the true. A clockmaker did not think in wards. A clockmaker thought in sequence, in the order of small movements timed to one another, in the difference between a thing turned now and the same thing turned a moment later. She had been trying to hold the first gate and work the second at the same instant. Josiah had built it to be worked in time. The first gate held, a slow count, then the second eased in the pause the mechanism left for exactly that count. She went back to the door with that single idea, and on the afternoon of the 5th day, with Reed watching from the step and the light going gold across the dry grass, she held the forward gate in its false position, counted slow against the beat of her own blood, and on the breath of the count, she felt the second gate lift, smooth as a held promise, and the great iron case gave a sound she would never forget. A deep, single knock from inside the door, like a heart that had been waiting 11 years to beat once more. The lock was open. Reed made a sound behind her that was half a laugh and half something older, and Ada knelt with her hand flat against the cold iron and let herself, for one moment, simply breathe. Stay with her a moment longer at the top of that stair, because what she found below is the whole reason the valley was warned away from it. The opening of the lock was only the question answered. The cellar was the confession itself. The door swung outward with a groan, and the cold came up the stair to meet her, cold and dry and old, the held breath of a sealed place, smelling of stone and iron and tallow, and beneath all of it the faint sweetness of old paper. She lit the lamp full and went down. 11 steps cut into the slope, each one worn shallow in the center where a man had gone up and down them for years before he sealed them away. And at the bottom she stood in a small stone room, perhaps 12 feet by 10, dry as a tomb, lined on 3 sides with shelves, and she lifted the lamp and saw that Josiah Vance had not been hiding gold at all. He had been hiding records. The shelves held boxes, plain wooden boxes with hinged lids, dovetailed at the corners by a careful hand, and a fine gray dust lay over all of them undisturbed. The dust of 11 sealed winters, so that her own breath stirred small ghosts of it into the lamplight. The boxes held papers, and the papers, when she lifted the first lid and held the lamp close, were deeds. Land deeds. Dozens of them. Scores of them. Each one a parcel in that valley and the valleys around it, and each one bearing a name she half knew. The names of families who had been bought out, or driven out, or foreclosed upon, in the years the Helena Stock and Land Company had been gathering the country into its hand. She set the lamp on the shelf, and she sat down on the cold floor, and she began to read, and the cold of the stone came up through her skirts, and she did not feel it. And the longer she read, the more clearly she understood what Josiah Vance had built, and why he had built a lock like a trap to hold it. The Helena Company had not bought the valley honestly. It had bought it on forged paper. Josiah Vance, the clockmaker, the man with the suspicious heart, had seen it happen and had done the one thing a man with his particular gifts could do. He had copied. For every parcel the company claimed by a note no one had signed or a deed no one remembered making, Josiah had obtained or reconstructed the true record, the original filing, the honest line of ownership, and he had kept it. He had been building, box by box, year by year, the proof that the largest landholder in the territory held its empire on a foundation of lies. And he had sealed it behind a lock that only a craftsman could open, accepted it from his own mortgage so the company could never seize it lawfully, and warned the valley away from it so that no frightened neighbor would ever blunder in and burn it for fear of what it might cost them to be caught holding it. In the largest box on the top of the stack lay a single sheet in Josiah's own hand, not a deed but a letter, undated, addressed to no one and to whoever came. Ada read it twice by the lamp. It said that the writer had no children and few friends and less time. and that he had spent his last years gathering what he was about to seal away, and that he did not know who would open it or when. It said that the lock would keep out the company, and keep out the fearful, and keep out the merely greedy, and that it would open only for a patient and an honest hand, because such a hand was the only kind he was willing to trust with the power the boxes held. It said, near the end, in a line she would carry the rest of her life, that proof is a patient animal, that it will wait in the dark longer than any liar can keep his lie standing, and that all it asks is one person willing to dig. Among the deeds in a box of its own, she found the original note against the Vance Ranch, the true note, signed by Josiah for a sum a tenth the size of the one Calloway had read to her, with a schedule of payments and a clear date of final discharge, paid in full, marked and witnessed 4 years before Josiah died. She held it to the lamp and read the witness line at the foot of it twice over, the clerk's confirmation that the debt was satisfied and the lien released, and she understood at last what had nagged at her that first evening at the kitchen table. The 2 round and 2 large number underscored in a stranger's neat ink. The note the company held against her was a forgery built on a discharged debt. They had taken a paid loan, inflated it, recompounded it from a false date, and presented the result to a grieving widow as the simple arithmetic of her ruin. And the proof that it was a lie had been lying 11 steps under her own kitchen the whole time, behind a door she had been warned never to open. She climbed back up into the daylight with the true note in her hand and the letter in her satchel. And Bartholomew Reed read her face before she said a word. She did not gloat. There was nothing in her of the triumph a person might expect. What she felt, standing in the gold light with 11 years of cold still on her hands, was closer to grief. Grief for all the families whose names were on the shelves below, who had lost their land in the dark while the proof of their right to it lay sealed a few miles away. She told Reed what was down there, plainly, and the old man took off his hat, which she had never seen him do, and held it against his chest and said the name of his own brother, who had been foreclosed off a quarter section in the bad winter 11 years gone and had died soon after, and asked whether it might be down there too. Ada said she did not know yet. She said she would look. She said it as a promise, and Reed put his hat back on and wiped his good eye with the back of his root-hard hand and said he would help her carry the boxes up, as many as his old back could manage, for as long as it took. What followed took the rest of the spring and most of the summer, and it was not dramatic, and that was the point. Ada did not ride into town with a pistol or a speech. She did what her father would have done. She read every paper in the cellar, sorted them by name and by parcel, and by date, and she copied the most important of them in her own careful hand, so that no single fire could destroy the truth twice. She took the true note against her own ranch down to the same lawyer who had read her the false one, and she laid the discharged original on his desk beside the company's inflated demand, and she watched the man's face change as he understood what he was looking at. He was not a brave man, but he was not a dishonest one either, and a discharged note witnessed and dated is a hard thing for any lawyer to argue with. He agreed to file it. He agreed when she showed him the second box and the third, to write to the Territorial Land Office in the capital, and to a federal surveyor he knew, men whose business it was to care about forged filings, men over whom the Helena Company held no note. Royce Calloway came out to the ranch one more time, in the heat of July, when word had begun to move through the valley that the widow Vance had opened the cellar and that something had come up out of it. He was not gentle this time. He sat at her table uninvited, and he told her in the same low voice that she was meddling in matters she did not understand, that papers could be disputed, that a clever forger might have made those documents himself, that a woman alone should think carefully about the friends she did and did not have in this country. Ada listened to all of it. Then she told him, level and quiet, that the records were already copied, that copies were already in the hands of the land office and the surveyor, and that the originals were no longer in the cellar, nor in the house, nor anywhere he would find them. She told him she had no wish to ruin any man, only to set the records straight, and that the truth would do whatever it did without any help from her temper. She didn't raise her voice. She had learned from a lock that the only argument worth making is the one the other side cannot force. Calloway looked at her a long moment, and for the first time the courtesy was entirely gone from his face, and what was under it was fear. The particular fear of a man who has built his standing on paper and has just understood that better paper exists. He looked for one moment like a man counting in his head and not liking the sum. He didn't threaten her again. He stood, and he gathered his hat from the table, and he glanced once toward the kitchen floor as though he could see through the boards to the empty cellar below. And then he walked out, and he rode back toward town. And that was the last she saw of him at her table. What became of him she learned only in pieces over the following year, the way you learn of weather in a distant country. The Territorial Land Office opened an inquiry. The federal surveyor confirmed that a number of the company's foundational filings did not match the true records of the office. The Helena Stock and Land Company, which had seemed as permanent as the mountains, began to come apart at the joints the way a thing comes apart when you discover it was only ever glued quietly in offices far from the valley, undone not by a gunshot, but by the slow weight of documents that would not stop being true. Calloway left the territory. No one met him in a final reckoning. He simply became a smaller and smaller figure in the story until he was gone from it, which is the only fate a forger truly fears, to be made irrelevant by the truth he tried to bury. Ada did not grow rich. She might have. There were those who told her that with the proof in her hands, she could have pressed claims, taken commissions, made herself the broker of every righted wrong in the valley. She did not. She returned what was not hers to return. Box by box, name by name, she carried the truth back to the families it belonged to. She walked the discharge deeds and the true filings to the doors of people who had spent 11 years believing they had been beaten fairly. And she put the proof of their right into their own hands and let them do with it what they would. At one such door, a low soddy on a poor flat south of the creek, a woman near her own age came out wiping flour from her hands, and Ada laid on the rough plank table the true filing, for the ground that woman's husband had been turned off of when she was a new bride, and watched the woman read it slowly, her lips moving, and then sit down hard on the bench as though her legs had been taken from under her. The woman did not weep, and she did not thank her. She only asked in a voice gone thin whether it was real, whether it would hold. And Ada said that it was the true record and that the land office had already confirmed others like it, and that it would hold as long as paper held. Some of them got their land back. Some of them got only the bitter peace of knowing they had been cheated and not merely outmatched. To Bartholomew Reed she brought the record of his brother's quarter section, the honest filing under the false one, and the old man held it and did not speak for a long time. And then he said his brother had died thinking himself a failure, and that he had not been one, and that this was worth more to him than the land. He had the deed entered in his brother's name and his brother's children's after him, and he planted that next spring a row of apple trees along the fence line of the recovered quarter, one for each of them. The note against the Vance ranch was struck down. The lawyer filed the discharged original, the land office confirmed it, and the false demand evaporated like the lie it had always been. Ada Vance owned her house and her land and her cattle, free and clear, by the honest arithmetic of a debt her husband's uncle had paid before she ever came west. She kept the ranch. She was not a natural rancher, and she never became a great one. But she learned it the way she had learned the lock, slowly, by returning to it, and the valley that had warned her off the cellar came, over the seasons, to leave its hard things at her gate. A stuck strongbox, a lost key, a mechanism no one else could read, because word had gone round that the locksmith's daughter could open what others could not, and that she would tell you the truth of what she found, and take only the fair price for the finding. She never sealed the cellar again. She cleaned it out, and she shelved her father's tools along the dry stone walls where Josiah's boxes had stood, and she used it for what it was, a cool, dry room under the kitchen. And on the hottest days of summer she would go down the 11 steps into the old cold and sit a while among the files and the picks and the quiet. She kept Josiah's letter. She kept it not in the cellar but in the trunk in the house, beside the deed. And now and then in the years that followed, she would take it out and read the line about proof being a patient animal. And she would think of the clockmaker she had never met, the bitter and clever man who had built his suspicious heart into a lock and trusted it to wait for a hand he would never live to see. That hand had come. It had grown up at a locksmith's bench in St. Joseph, learning that a lock is a question and that every question has an answer. And it had come west as a bride, and been left a widow and been told by 3 men on a porch that it had no business at the top of those stairs. It had gone down anyway, and the thing the whole valley had been warned never to touch turned out to be the one thing that set the whole valley right. Years later, when she was an old woman and the apple trees along Reed's fence line had grown tall enough to throw shade, a young girl from one of the recovered families asked Ada why she had opened the cellar when everyone had told her not to. Ada thought about it for a while. The way her father used to turn a coin he was not sure was real. Then she said that a warning and an instruction can wear the very same words, and that the only way to tell them apart is to ask who the words are meant to protect. A warning that protects the powerful, she said, is only a lock, and she had been raised to open locks. The girl did not fully understand, the way the young rarely do, and Ada did not press it. She only walked the girl out to the kitchen and lifted the trapdoor in the floor and let her look down the 11 worn steps into the cool dark, where a row of small bright files caught the lamplight along the dry stone wall, exactly where they had waited all those years for someone patient enough and honest enough to come down and read them.